My name is Ted Friedman. I am the historian of the New York State Council for the years 2024 to 2025. I was also the president of the State Council from 2001 to 2002. As I am talking to myself, or speaking for myself, it will be a monologue instead of a dialogue with another president. I joined the State Council when I had moved back from Kansas, and I'd always been a joiner. So that when I moved back, I said, okay, I want to join a professional organization. However, I was very confused when I started. It seemed that there were two organizations. I would go to meetings and one person would be saying, oh, I'm the president of the State Council. And in another meeting, another person would be saying, I'm the president. It took me 6 months to realize that there were two organizations, a local chapter and a state chapter. When I was in Kansas, it was only the Kansas Society of Hospital Pharmacists, one state organization. When I was in Kansas and I said to my director, I'm going to be moving to New York and I'm working at Montefiore, he said, oh, you're going to probably be working with Kurt Kleinman. That was the first past president that I actually met in my interview. I didn't get to know Kurt very well initially, but through the years, I did find out he was a wonderful man, very professional, outgoing, loved softball. He was very intense on the softball field. And he was very intense in the pharmacy, looking to progress the profession as much as possible. The second past president I met also was in my interview was Marvin Liu. Marvin was one of my direct reports, or I reported directly to him, I should say. And I got to know him, and he was a sweet man. He really took you under your wing and wanted to help you along with almost everything he did, or you did, I should say. The next couple of past presidents that I met, it was on my first day. I was a new staff at Montefiore, and there was this new resident who was just started the day before, or the week before possibly, Nancy DiLiegro. And we became fast friends, even though she was, quote, management and I was staff. We got along famously, and through the years, she has been a help and a good friend and a colleague to me. Second person I met who was on staff at that point for at least a period of time was Mike Blumenfeld. And Mike and I became fast friends, and we went up through the council together in various different positions. The final past president I met at Montefiore was Alan Caspi. He was at the time the director of drug information, and I interacted with him somewhat, but not that much. But I did get to know him as a very professional person. I had also enrolled in St. John's and started my master's degree, where I met the next past president. I went to class on the first day, and the professor was sitting with his feet up, reading the New York Times. That was my introduction to Bernie Mel. I got to know Bernie over 30 years of working with him and for him. He was a mentor, a friend, colleague. He was my boss, but He was much, much more. He was the quintessential professional and pharmacist that I would try and uh, ascend to become. After my residency, I started working at Brookdale, where I met two other past presidents, Seymour Katz and Ray Sandusky. Seymour, again, one of those people that it's an honor to work for him. He was professional. He took his department of 6 when he started, and when I left, the department was up to about 47 pharmacists. He started unit dose, he started TPN, he was moving the profession along at a very breakneck speed. He also was on the State Board of Pharmacy, and he looked at what he did there to make sure that he was doing what the Board of Pharmacy would want to be done. Ray was his second in command, and he was what I would call a big teddy bear, although wouldn't want to get on the bad side of him. He was he was liked, well liked, and he took the professional organization to heart. He was president for 2 years, and got me involved, as Seymour did too. Seymour was the one that actually told me, the City Society is looking for a bulletin editor. Why don't you contact Bruce Kay? And that's when I started on the ladder, so to speak, of moving up. Through the years, I've met a number of other past presidents, and again, have become friends with them. Lee Briscoe Dwyer, Frank Sosnowski, John and I joined the state board, the New York State Council's Board of Directors at the same time. John Manzo was another one that I was involved with through a number of years in both the local chapter as well as the state council. And Tom Lombardi was also my immediate past president. He was the president before me. Bruce Pleskow was another one that became a friend and a colleague throughout the years. As I said, Seymour was the one that encouraged me to become involved in the local chapter. I was on the City Society board for about 10 years, and I performed various functions: bulletin editor, recording secretary, director at large, and finally presidential roles. As I moved, I again met a number of other past presidents in my roles. Later on, Karen Falk, Fran Jordan, Anthony Longo. During my tenure with both the city and the state, there were many different trying times, some of which were internal, some of which were external. During the mid-'80s, the City Society was made up of all 5 boroughs at that time. Pharmacists from the outer boroughs of Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island felt they were not getting the appropriate representation, and they seceded from the City Society and formed their own chapter, the Royal Chapter. More than once, board members, either of the City Society or the state, started to become ghosts. and did not accept their responsibilities, and others had to pick up the slack. In my tenure in the state council, they moved many times from Long Island to Rochester, then back to Albany. Sometimes this put a financial burden on the council. At one point, we lost our executive director as she had decided to move out of state, and the office was run by a staff, and there wound up becoming some discrepancy in the funding and the budget and the bookkeeping. So when the new director came in, they improved the controls that were needed, and they instituted double checks so that this would not happen again. During my presidency, unfortunately, I was there during 9/11, and that presented a number of problems, some of which were, should we hold meetings? The city was in a terrible state at that point. And the council, we felt we wanted to push through it. So we had, in the past, we used to have a mid-year clinical meeting, and that occurred in October. So the first thing we need to do is whether or not we were going to have the mid-year clinical, which we decided that we did want. And it came off very well. There were other issues that came up during that year where some of the chapters were starting to lose membership and lose funding, and were struggling to maintain their chapter at a level that was acceptable. So at that point, we met with the local people, and this was the Mid-Hudson chapter. There is no more Mid-Hudson chapter. They finally failed, and the people that were in that Mid-Hudson chapter was reabsorbed into both Westchester and Albany. The Mid-Hudson chapter went from Rockland County up to Greene County, so that all the people in that center of the state, which surrounded, Kingston, Saugerties, Poughkeepsie, all of those cities where the hospitals were part of the Mid-Hudson chapter. The Southern Tier was also struggling at the time. It has come back, but again, it's struggled through the years. Board meetings. When I first joined, we used to have 4 face-to-face meetings and 4 additional conference calls because Zoom calls weren't available. The 4 face-to-face meetings were usually July, mid-year clinical were around October, then January, and the assembly, which was in the spring. We would try and hold the board meetings, the face-to-faces, adjacent to some of the other meetings. So like the summer, it was by itself, but the fall would be close to the mid-year clinical, and the winter meeting in January, we tried to hold near at the time, it was the leadership conference. And the spring meeting was by the assembly. Conference calls were held every other month or every 2 months, so that we would constantly be in touch with one another. The meetings were usually from Wednesday night to Friday afternoon, so that we get there in the evening. We'd possibly have dinner together or not, depending on who got there when. We'd start at 8 o'clock in the morning, and we'd go through 5 o'clock when we'd break for dinner and get together at one of the local bars or the hotel bar just to unwind and just have a little bit of fun or camaraderie. We'd start up again Sunday morning with a Friday morning, in which case we would go through noon, and then everybody would head back to their respective cities. Meetings were very professional, and each director would speak on of their committees and what they were doing. Sometimes they did get loud and contentious, but all in all, it would stay professional. And again, as I said, after hours, we bonded and had fun with various locations. Was the presidency everything I expected? Yes. After being on the city board for so many years and seeing all of the previous past presidents before me, I had a very good idea of what to expect. I also had two very good mentors that I worked for, Bernie Mill and Joe Meschel, who both gave me guidance throughout the years. Joe was never president, but had held many offices in the state council. I remember that when I had accepted the nomination of the state council, we were beginning a search for the executive director. Bernie pulled me aside and said, if you're going to be the president, you need to be on that search committee, because that person you'll be working very closely with, and you need to have input into who it was. I met and interviewed all of the different candidates, and we selected Deb Feinberg, who became our next director of council, executive director. We also became very good friends and colleagues throughout the year. I've had many memorable moments as a president. I traveled to each chapter throughout the state for various meetings, some local chapters and some state functions. As many as I could get, I wanted to install all of the new chapters, officers, and presidents. I made it to all the southern chapters, as well as the Albany chapter, to install the president. The mid-year was in Syracuse, and I was installed in Buffalo. Finally, I made 2 trips to local meetings in Rochester and the Southern Tier. From New York, that's about an 8-hour drive. So I drove up there one evening, got up to the meeting, and the following day we drove back, and I was back at work a day after. I was also very vocal about having a liaison to each chapter. The liaison from the state council is the voice of the chapter at the state board, as well as the voice of the state board at the local chapter. In my years as president and most of my board time, I selected probably the most vocal local chapter that was around, who constantly complained about various things. I'm not going to say which one, but they were always at arms with anything we were doing. And I listened, and I took everything to heart, and I brought any of their issues back to the state board, state council's board. The annual assembly when I started, I attended the annual assembly. The council membership was about 2,500. The installation banquet was held and about 700 to 800 people were in attendance. So you have this room with massive numbers of people. The locations were always being moved across the state and out of state a couple of times. When I first started, it was in the Catskill Mountains. Catskill hotels were primary location of the initial years. 1982, Grossingers. 1983, Vista International, New York City. That was at the Twin Towers. And it was a wonderful time, but the city tended to be more of an attraction than the state council was. So a lot of members didn't make educational meetings because they'd prefer to be going to a show or shopping. 1984 to 1986, or I'm sorry, 1984 and 1986 was the Concord Hotel in the Catskills. 1985, we tried something different. We went to Hershey, Pennsylvania. So we were out of the state, and we did get flack from people because we were out of the state. 1987, 89, and 92, we were up at the Sagamore Hotel. That was the first few years that we actually were there, and we had a wonderful time. 1988, we were in Buffalo. 1990, we were at the Pines Hotel in the Catskills, back there again. 1991, we were in Rochester. 1993, we were in the Four Seasons in New Jersey, Playboy Club. Again, out of state. And we did get a number of people complaining that this is a New York State Council. 1994, 1996, 1998, we went back to the Sagamore. 1995, we were at the Neverly Hotel. 1997, it was Buffalo again. 1999 was Rochester. 2000, 2002, 2004, we were back at the Sagamore. 2001, it was the Buffalo Hilton. 2003, it was the Rye Hilton in Westchester. 2005, 2006, 2005 was the Saratoga Hilton. And then 2006, 7, 8, and 9 was the Sagamore Hotel. And thereafter, 2010, 12, and 14 was Saratoga. 2011, 2013, we tried to Turning Stone in Verona. 2015 and 2017 were the last 2 years at the Sagamore Hotel. 2016 through 2019, it was a Saratoga. I'm sorry, that was a Sagamore Hotel. And 2016 to 2019 was Saratoga. 2020 was canceled because of COVID. 2021 was a virtual meeting. And 2022 through 2025, we were back at Saratoga Hilton. Annual Assembly for a number of years began to decline in attendance, especially in the early aughts or 2000s to 2009. The installation banquet became 125 in attendance, down from that 800. A lot of times this was caused by pharma consolidating, and so many of the local reps came to the exhibit that were local, and they went home. They'd rather be home with their families. Understood. So we needed to try and figure out to try and get that installation banquet to be a little bit more impressive. So changes were made to the schedule to try and correct this. And the reverse of exhibits were developed. It was what industry really wanted, and it retained them to stay at the assembly for the installation banquet. Once the assembly started with the residency meeting, our attendance once again rose, and we were at a point where we actually are limited to where we can hold this meeting, as some of the other locations we use are just too small. My presidential year at the assembly was a whirlwind. I was busy the entire time. I wanted to attend every function possible, whether they be educational, professional, or just fun. So I was up at 6 o'clock in the morning to do the fun run. I was up at 6 o'clock in the morning to work at the softball game. I was there at the end of the night when we were having all the parties and hospitality suites. I had to give kudos to my executive director. Ted Friedman always kept me on my path. That position is the linchpin in the organization. And Sean Flynn is doing a wonderful job now. Again, he or the executive director is the thing that holds the council together many times. Generational changes. I'm a boomer. I have very different perspective than Gen X and millennials. I've always been a volunteer. I always look at jobs knowing that what I have to do to learn. I always look at jobs knowing that I have to learn what I have to do. And I do that so that I can lead. I felt the same way in the council. I'd spent 10 years in the New York City chapter board, 2 years as editor on the State Council Journal, 1 year on the State Council Board learning, and 2 years as Director of Education before assuming the role of president. Even though I was only on the position at a director's level for 2 years, my years in the city's chapter allowed the confidence and knowledge to assume the role of president. As Director of Education, I attended many lectures talking about generational changes in the workforce, and I was amazed as I interviewed candidates for staff positions at the hospital. After I explained that a hospital is open 365 days a year, and that the new staff would have to be working holidays and be off some holidays. I asked my final question, do you have any questions of me? And I received the quintessential answer that I always figured I would get. Will I be able to be off Christmas through New Year's because my parents are going on vacation? The answer is no. New members of the council are intelligent and very up to date with all the technology at their fingertips, literally. Social media and AI are moving us forward, but we must have leaders who know what the roles of the president are, or even what directors entail. Sometimes they start out and say, I can do this, and they find out that they are too deep and fail. We need to train and nurture these leaders. Most importantly, we must educate them to what they won't be doing when they accept the presidential role for these years. Because otherwise, again, if we don't tell them what to expect, they're going to start off and just say, nah, I can't do this, and just walk away. Final nuggets. Getting involved in the organization will help you with your life goals. It will enrich you as you will be able to address issues and problems and with work, with groups, with committees to accomplish goals. It is time consuming and tedious at times, but in the end, well worth your effort. With that, I wish you all well. and thank you.